In today's scripture, Matthew forgot to mention that Jesus is a mermaid. You'll have to insert that yourselves. Now, after they had left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother by night, and went to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. When Herod died, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who were seeking the child's life are dead." Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And after being warned in a dream, he went to the district of Galilee. There he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene.
For the past 5 weeks, we have been exploring different texts from the narrative lectionary that have taken us through Hebrew scripture from 2-3 centuries even before Jesus' birth, so that we could explore the kind of world that Jesus was coming into. And what we're finding is that the world even before Jesus came into it was a lot like first century world that Jesus entered. There was a lot of fear. There was a lot of anger and hatred. There was a lot of violence. And there were a lot of decisions being made based on revenge and evil rather than love and goodness. And then what we're seeing when we look at our own day is that our own lives, in fact, have our own share of injustice and pain and suffering. Not to mention the abuse of power and influence that was, in fact, part of the first century culture and still 2,000 years later exists. So I got to ask, 2,000 years after the birth of this child who is from the Spirit, who is Emmanuel, God with us, shouldn't that picture have changed just a little bit? What is the difference of Jesus coming into this world as we know it? We've studied it all the way back through the Hebrew scriptures, through the first century, and now we know it as we live today. Has it really changed all that much? In fact, sometimes it seems like it might even be getting worse. So what is the point of Jesus, Emmanuel, coming into this world to be present with us? Our narrative today talks about a first century ruler who hears of an infant king, the possibility of which threatens his very existence. And instead of trying to come to an understanding of who this possible king might be, it's a Jewish king, after all. It's part of his heritage. Instead of reaching out to him and finding out what possibilities exist within this infant, this leader gets all threatened and lashes out at anyone who may threaten the future of his security. Now, where is God in that? Our main person in this story is again Joseph, who we've heard from before, because Joseph had heard from an angel and said it was okay to go ahead and take Mary, who was already pregnant, as his wife, because this child that Mary was having is a child of the Spirit. And Joseph is still reeling from that message and trying to be both a husband and a father simultaneously when he gets a visit from another angel, telling him now that he's in danger and they must get up and flee. I don't know if I can tell this story any better than Rebecca did. But you can imagine what Joseph was thinking, right? What? You've got to be kidding me. I listened to the angel the last time, married this woman, have this child. I'm caring for them the best way I know how. And this is a child of the Spirit and I'm being threatened? How could something from the Spirit be a threat to anyone? And how could anyone be a threat to that Spirit? Joseph must be thinking this messenger is kind of crazy at this point. Not to mention that where the messenger tells them to flee to for safety is Egypt. What do we know about Egypt? Joseph is a Jew. The entire tradition and story of the collective Jewish people is wrapped around escaping Egypt. Why would anyone go there for safety purposes? That couldn't be right. That couldn't be what the messenger was trying to say. Maybe Joseph misheard it. And even if they were to go to Egypt, what would they do once they got there? They couldn't even find anyone in Bethlehem, their own kin, to take them in when they were in the midst of labor. How are they going to find somebody in Egypt to take them in? How are they going to survive when they get there? And even if they do, what happens if the ruler there is worse than Herod? How do we know that Herod actually is chasing them? Joseph has all these questions. A visit from an angel to Joseph is a scary proposition. This is not something Joseph takes lightly, and it's beginning to be a pattern. So much like he followed the advice of the messenger without knowing why the first time, by trusting in who sent the messenger, he does it again. He gets up and he takes his wife and his child and he flees to Egypt. Now, as I'm thinking this, I'm thinking, wouldn't it be great if we all had these angels among us who would tell us of impending doom, even when we can't see it coming? Wouldn't that be great? Would we listen if we did? Probably not. So you might have already heard it. Moving on in our story, we have Herod, another character. Herod is the king of Judea. Herod had that position for almost 70 years. He is known as one of the greatest builders in that era of kings in Judea. He built all kinds of wonderful things to prosper all of Judea, but he was also known for his incredible cruelty. And he lived out that cruelty in this story by infant genocide. As the story goes, he's incredibly upset that the wise men have betrayed him and have not come back to let him know where this possible king of the Jews is. He knows it's a baby, and he knows they went to find it, and he assumes that they did, but they never came back to tell him who it was or where to find that child. So instead of trying to come up with a different way to consider the identity of this child, he just lashes out for all children. Any baby, 2 years of age or younger, any anywhere surrounding any place in Bethlehem where the wise men fled to should be killed. A slaughter of the innocents, a genocide, incredible cruelty, no compassion whatsoever, no even chance at looking for an alternative ways to accomplish what he wants. It's vicious. It's cruel. We understand that story because we have it in our own time as well. We join Rachel's weeping for her children because we know the cruelty of such violence, even against children. Josephus is a Jewish historian who wrote, even clear back then, and documented a lot of these things. And he speaks about Herod's cruelty. Apparently he was infamous in his cruelty. Even Caesar recognized that Herod was so cruel that he said it was better to be a pig in Herod's house than it was to be a member of Herod's family. Apparently Herod ordered the execution of 3 of his own sons. Compassion is not high on his priority list. He's in it for himself. He's in it for his own security, his own leadership, and his own success. He's not worried about anyone else. This is the evil that exists in the world in first century. We heard about it in Habakkuk. We heard about it in Esther. We hear about it today. It's a really hard story for us to hear, but that's exactly why Matthew tells it. Matthew wants us to be aware of how Jesus' life connects to God's. How the story and the narrative that draws us all together comes together. When Matthew tells this story, he is constantly referring to Jesus and the parallels between Jesus and Moses. And he does that in lots of different ways. In the story that we're hearing today, we can compare it to the Moses story. Jesus was an infant who was threatened as an infant by a malicious leader. Joseph had the same thing happen to him. Remember, his mom had to put him in a basket and float him down the river? Same thing. And he had to exile into Egypt in order to find safety. Same story. It's not his own land. It's a foreign land. It's a scary place. But it's safer than where he was. The same is true in Moses' story. And like Moses, the one who is delivered is the one that ends up delivering the people. Moses frees the entire nation of Israel from slavery in Egypt and brings them out into a new way of being in the world. Freedom. Jesus, as Emmanuel, God with us, frees us all. And once again, we see the parallel where God's story of love and saving grace is far stronger than any evil that resists it. The parallels between Moses and the people of Israel and Jesus and the rest of the world are astounding in Matthew. And the reason why he does it is he wants you to see that Jesus' story is connected to God's story, all the way back through the history of Israel, recognizing where God has always been working in the world and is still working through Jesus. If it was true then, if it was true in first century, is it possible that it's true now? That's what Matthew is getting at. It would be easy to dismiss this story as just a story if it weren't for the fact that we can resonate with the violence it represents. We in our own time experience that. We have pain and suffering and isolation. We have violence that's escalating and leading to more violence. We have hatred and anger that's turning into revenge. It is a hard story for us to hear, but that's exactly why Matthew tells it, because it's our story too. Not only is Jesus connected to Moses and the story of the people of Israel, but we are connected to that story as well. Life is not any easier since the freedom of the Jews from slavery. Life is not any easier since the birth of Emmanuel into our lives. That's not what Matthew's trying to tell us. Matthew is telling us that violence is real. Evil in the world is real. But that God is with us. Always has been, always will be. Today, our own children are at risk. In Pakistan, there was a school shooting. You know, in America alone, in the last 4 years, since 2010, there have been 106 school shootings. That includes Sandy Hook. It includes Newtown. It includes Atlanta, Georgia. It includes Los Angeles. It includes 100 places throughout the country, including Omaha, Nebraska. It's our story too. At the very beginning of last year, an entire school of girls was kidnapped. Nobody knew where they went. Some were returned, some were not, some still don't know where they are. And we have thousands of families who every day are knocking on the borders of a foreign land, seeking asylum, running away from tyrants, economic despair, all kinds of tragedies in their lives. Many of those are unaccompanied children who are knocking on our borders. We understand the violence that Matthew talks about today. It's not something we can dismiss. It's a part of our life too, and it's our story. Matthew's point is to try to connect our story to God's story. And he does that through the language of fulfillment. Throughout this entire narrative, he talks about fulfilling prophecy. This was to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." That was in verse 15. He talks about, then it was fulfilled what Jeremiah had said. This is, a voice was heard in Ramah of loud lamentations, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be consoled, for the children are gone. Then he made his home in a town called Nazareth, so that what had been spoken through the prophets might be fulfilled. He will be called a Nazarene. Now, what exactly is Matthew trying to say with this fulfillment? Is he saying that God knew that all this was coming? That God is somehow in on the genocides of our lives? I think instead, it's not God who's being blamed for the violence in the world. It's Herod and people like Herod. What Matthew is pointing us to with this fulfillment language is having us see that violence has been happening all along. It's been with us since stories began, and it's still with us now. But so is God. God has been with us since the beginning of the story, and our story is connected to that story. Jesus is connected to that story. God with us is far greater than the resistance that we face in the world. In the midst of our pain, in the midst of our suffering, in the midst of our overwhelming grief, God shares with us love, grace, and life, and offers us an alternative way home. Because when we weep with Rachel, God hears that voice and meets us there in the very depth of our despairs. It's a hard truth for Mary and Joseph to understand, that even though they're carrying the child of the Spirit, life is not getting any easier for them. In fact, it's getting harder. And for Jesus himself, he has to realize that the persecutions and the grief and the sorrow and all the temptations that he's going to have to bear are still to come. And we too have to realize that God didn't come into our lives in order to make our lives easier, but to be with us in both the pain and the sorrow. That is Emmanuel. Jesus made a difference because he was with us in our pain, shares our story, connects us to God's story in a way that makes it very clear that we're all a part of the same story, and that we connect with one another in God's love and God's grace. Stephanie Anthony is a Presbyterian pastor who also blogs for a blog called Rev Gal Pals. A bunch of women pastors blogging together about the text, and they're following the narrative lectionary alongside us. And Stephanie's commentary this week included this phrase: "The promise of the incarnation is not that all difficulties will cease to exist, but that in the middle of them all, God is trying to do something completely different. Not fighting power with power, but overcoming power by choosing weakness. Not fighting violence with violence, but offering peace in the midst." Jesus did not come to help us escape from the world, but to help us live more fully within it, knowing that in the midst of the struggle, God is with us. It's not absent of struggle, but heaven is found in the heart of it. In our memorials today, we celebrate the lives of people who touched us deeply. We recognize the goodness that they brought to our lives, their stories, their hugs, their laughter. They walked alongside us in our lives, in both our pain and our joys. And that's why they're important. That's why we grieve. Because if they weren't good people in our lives, we wouldn't grieve them. But they are. They touched us. They walked with us. They're a part of who we are. They're a part of our story. But we would want them to be a part of our story, even if it means we grieve when we lose them. That's how we're connected to each other, to Jesus, to God. God's story is always going to be greater than the evil that resists it. And because we're connected, our identity is wrapped up in that story. We are beloved children of God. The God who was with us at the very beginning and continues still to be a part of our story. That's Emmanuel. That's God with us. And Jesus represents this story best at the depth of his pain, preparing for his death, where he shares a meal with his disciples, and he tells them This is my body, given for you. Take and eat this in remembrance of me, that I am with you. And again, after supper, in the same manner, he took the cup, and after giving thanks, gave it to all to drink, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, shed for you and for all people for the forgiveness of sin. Do this in remembrance of me." For as often as we eat of this bread and drink of this cup, we remember Emmanuel. We remember Jesus' story is connected to ours, and that all of our stories are connected to God's. And in that, we find joy in the midst of our pain. In that, we stand at the foot of this cross, knowing that God meets us in the depths of our pain, and at the point where that pain intersects the joy of life. This is the story we remember. This is the pain we all share, and the joy that helps us think that there is a different alternative, a different response to life, and another way home. These are the gifts of God for the people of God. Please join us. I invite the deacons up to help us prepare this meal, and as they come forward, let us remember our identity as God's beloved people together. We are an open and affirming family of faith, welcoming all to God's table of love and acceptance. We are diverse, yet united by Christ's example. We care for one another, support one another, and challenge one another to become all that God creates us to be. We work together to nurture our community and to promote peace and justice in our conflicted world. Amen. You do not have to be a member of Countryside to participate with us in this meal, but if you decide to join us, we hope that you will take a chunk of the bread off the loaf and dip it in the grape juice. And as you take it in, remember